Okay, we're recording. This is the Coach Support Show where science meets strategy. And today we're going to do something a little bit different than we've done in the past. Recently had an episode of Coach Talk with Duffman, who was last year the assistant coach of G2, but he's been involved in basically all the most successful European League of Legends teams of all time. And so we're going to kind of bounce off a few of the points that came up there, expand on them in a bit more detail, and give some other perspectives on the same thing. I don't think there'll be anyone watching this who hasn't watched that episode, but if there is, please do so. I think it's so fantastic for all of us in coaching that Duffman is starting to speak a bit more publicly, because he's one of those people who's just in the background and in background of all these successful teams, and yet is somehow kind of invisible. So as an example, my favorite example, on his not on his Leaguepedia, but on his Liquidpedia, so the sort of second biggest site that people do online results tracking, he has the wrong picture. It's of someone else. So this guy has won 12 European titles. He's won an MSI title. He's literally like potentially the most successful coach in Western esports. And the picture is of Rodrigo instead of him. So go and watch that episode. But anyway, that's enough of an intro. What did you think about the episode, and what are some of the points that you'd like to chat about?
Sure. Hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Episode 3. Yeah, I watched it and loved it. I thought it was great, and it was refreshing actually in many ways because, as you say, I think he's a name that I've seen a lot, and I think I've seen a few snippets of some content involving him, but certainly this was really shining a light on what he does and why he does it, and there was some real rich detail there, which I really enjoyed. Um, and I noted while I was watching it, just some points I thought were, you know, things you have said in the past and agree with, and I saw some similarities in the way you sort of see the game and things like that. So it was really interesting. One of those being just how much he enjoys having an impact and seeing his work being used and doing well in practice when it's like unleashed. So that was really interesting. I think one of the first points that I noted was about when he comes into a team wanting to build a shared understanding around concepts and words and terms, and then being consistent once we've sort of found agreement about what we mean, consistent in using those terms and those ideas going forward. And I mean, it sounds really, really basic, but I think we spoke about in a previous episode just even slight differences in
Mm.
understanding about a concept can cause issues. So I thought
Yeah.
that was just as a first port of call. I thought that was a really
Yeah,
interesting
I think it's such
thing.
good advice. I think it's something that I'm such a big fan of. And as you say, the way that I would go about getting that terminology is actually basically the exact same as him. But it's such an important step to do, because there's enough variability and there's enough complexity that we can have a very similar definition. Tempo is an absolute classic one. We can have a very similar
Right.
definition, and actually we don't even notice, because 9 times out of 10 it's the same. And the 10th time there's also something else to chalk it up to. Like, oh, we did understand, we just slightly misexecuted, or something like that. And so you can actually go through an entire split or an entire year not meaning the same thing when you say the exact same important word, and you don't notice. So I actually did this with I won't say who. One of my clients who was in a professional league last year, in the second split, we were talking about this, and he understood it in the same way as I did. But I said, "Do you know that all your team understands it in the same way?" And he instantly said, "Yeah." And then there's a little pause. He's like, I think so. And then he was like, I'm actually going to find that out. So they did, after this was sort of 6 months in, they did have a sit down and say, okay, what does tempo mean? And it was very similar. And a couple of them meant it in the exact same way. And then you can start to reverse. Okay, I was I was working much better with these players and we were agreeing much more. And they thought this word means the same thing. And these other players who I was disagreeing with, actually just the word means a different thing. So could that just
Mhm.
be the cause of kind of all your issues?
Yeah, we're talking past each other. We're not actually, yeah, we're not analyzing the problem with looking at two different pictures. Yeah, a really, really interesting step. How far do you need to go with that as a league coach? Because I mean, there are so many concepts that get applied to the game that I've always been struck by the fact that a lot of these concepts don't actually come up within the game, as far as I'm aware. Like is the phrase wave management actually like something you come across if you just played uh, the pure version of the game? Like, is there a tutorial focused on that?
No, no, there's not going to be tutorials on kind of any of the stuff. The only tutorials that are there, and the only inbuilt terminology is really, really basic to kind of get you to your
Right.
very first game. But wave management, at least, is a kind of, yeah, that's a set of words which at least can mean the same thing quite easily, only because it just means how you're going to manage your
Mhm.
waves, rather than something like tempo, which could be quite specific. And I've
Right.
seen very, very varied definitions and very vague definitions and very complicated definitions. You ask some people about it, even some coaches, and they talk for like 3 or 4 minutes. And they say this is a really crucial concept. It's like, if it's a crucial concept, you can't be explaining it for 3 minutes. Like, we have to know what it means from a much deeper point of view. I think it's a very good
Mhm.
question, though, because another thing that came up there in the chat is building these kind of systems and how complicated you want it to be.
Yeah.
And Duffman actually made the point where, look, again, he's worked with the best players in Europe. And he says, actually, I always try and make it quite simple. So if you're listening to that and you're working in ERL1 or ERL2 or even other LEC teams, probably more simple than we're currently doing is always going to be good. And so the
Yeah.
way that I've always thought about it in the past is that your system either can cover absolutely or a huge percentage of this of the scenarios, and it's going to be unbelievably complicated, or it can cover very few scenarios and it can be unbelievably simple. And you need to kind of find that balance. So even if we're just talking about a system of how to make plans, I'll try and keep this applicable for people who don't know League of Legends. Waves come every 30 seconds. So either you can have a system that means we're going to talk about every single wave, what we're doing on every single wave, which I think for any team is too complicated because that's just way too much to go on. Or there's like a couple of crucial timers, which is like, okay, the first dragon spawns at this time, grub spawn at this time, baron spawns at this time. For a lot of teams, that actually might well be good enough, but it was also potentially too simple. So how are you going to
Mhm.
find that balance? So Duffman was talking about sort of sets of 3 waves, like 1.5 minutes, or like you take a big objective, but talk about not just that objective, but the minute before it as well, and those kind of things. So trying to find that balance, and I think you can
Yeah.
apply the same for terminology, where we do need words for the important things, and we do need to really drill down to what those words mean, but we don't necessarily need to define everything and give it our own name for absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And there's a lot which probably only need a slight adjustment. Another classic one for me is playing it slow. Like, what does that mean? People talk about we,
Yeah.
we should play this fight slow. And it is important to know actually what that means in detail, because for your support, maybe it means, okay, I'm going to throw my hook, but I'm not ever going to like recast it, or I'll only hook if it's the enemy high priority target. Or maybe it means I'm never going to throw my ability out because I think that is more slow, which it is. So trying to find out those kind of things are important.
Mhm.
But you're right. I don't think there's a. I could go into a team and say, okay, I'm going to have these 10 words and no more and no less.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's clearly important. And like you say, finding the balance between simplicity and complexity was something that I think he. It sounds like he does quite skillfully, and it's good practice as a starting point. Um, I once heard a coach talk about gating, which I
Yeah,
haven't come across in teams since, which was seemed like an interesting concept, but it
yeah,
was
I
certainly
love that
something that
one.
needed
Yeah,
unpacking and explaining. So it
yeah,
made a ton of sense once it was explained.
yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Do,
and then I think
do you have this
carry on.
kind of thing in sport?
Oh, for sure.
So
Yeah.
obviously, the sport has a lot more history, and so I don't know if we take something like basketball. I'm sure there's stuff like screens and stuff which there's
Yes.
no
That's the one.
deliberation on, or is there even a screen could mean something slightly different in a different team?
Well, I mean, yeah, there are different types of screens,
Okay,
and
but does everyone
depending
call the
on where
different
you are.
types the same different thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, people describe them based on sort of like where you position them,
Mm,
and then how you're setting your teammate up to use them. But I think even more interestingly is just the types of like defensive strategy you might apply to them. So you have things like a hedge, which essentially means that you step out to stop someone else, another attacker that you're not actually defending in that moment, but you step out to try and make it harder for them. But then you have a hard hedge, you have a soft hedge, you
mm,
have all sorts of terminology there. But it, it's easy to maybe there's like 7 or 8 main different types of defensive strategy in that situation. It's easy not to be up to speed with your teammates on like 2 or 3 of them.
Mm.
And so one of the best clubs I was part of had a guidebook to
Mm.
our primary strategies, offense, defense, and what the terms you should be looking for are. Because in my experience in sport, just based on the region you're in, the culture you grow up in, the same things have different terms and different applications. So a fairly obvious starting point, but it was I think really
Mm.
really good to see that being done in league.
Mm.
Um, and to your point about finding complexity as well, I enjoyed the fact that Duffman recognized that you could abstract to a very high level, which is it doesn't give you anything to work with on the ground, like in a day-to-day moment. That doesn't really help you decide what to do. And he sort of boiled it down to he got as far as triggers, I think it was the expression he used. So to your point about winding it back a little bit, seeing what might happen that might trigger your thinking about something coming up. I thought that was a really nice way of phrasing it and having a common set of triggers that are understood
Mm.
within the team.
Mm.
So just very like you can see the analytical side coming through, and
Yeah.
that was really cool.
Yeah. One of the other things that I think is really important for this kind of stuff that isn't done anywhere near enough on teams. Again, I guess I shouldn't say who, but there are some teams in the LEC now who are kind of doing this actively and proactively, I should say, rather than just actively. But finding what I would call a heuristic, I guess, is probably the most accurate term, but an
Mhm.
identity or whatever you want to say. But rather than finding it through play, let's actually just talk about it and decide. So we don't know our identity because we've played 6 months together and we work out when we win and when we lose gradually. But we actually go in and we find the heuristic, just the rule of thumb, that this is how we're going to evaluate the game. Because what we're doing, if we don't have one, whether we know it or not, is we're saying, I'm going to look at every single situation.
Yeah,
And if we look at it, I'll know which is the best thing to do. And that is wild when you
yeah,
think about it, even in review, let alone for when we're talking about actually making it practical in the game. And the other thing as well is that this is why I think it's very good that T1 are a good team. I don't think it. I know I'm a fan, so I like that they won worlds, but
controversial.
they play differently to other teams. I would say if you're talking about the thing that they value the most is different from other teams, and so there's maybe two or three different options at the top level. You could maybe say, okay, JDG play like this, or BLG, sorry, last year play like this, and they have this heuristic, and then T1 have this one, and Gen G maybe have this one. And the idea that any team who's not those three teams, or even just any team in general, it's not like, okay, T1 won, so that was the best. It's like they won this exact moment in this exact setup. But for us to be as good as Gen G, we'd take that, like so we should talk about it first, say what kind of team do we want to be? Do we want to be a kind of team that highly values tempo and playing fast and playing high speed? Do we want to be a team that plays high pressure? Do we want to play a team that plays high resources, for example? And then you can start saying, okay, therefore, those are the terminologies that we're going to really drill
Mm,
down on. And we need to know exactly what we mean when we're talking about tempo, if we're playing for it as our most important resource. Or we need to know, exactly how we're going to talk about the way we manage waves if the whole point is to just maximize our gold. And then when we can look at those situations, we're not looking at it just with what's the best. It's like we had these two options, which was the best for the one that we want to do, and we go
mhm.
that way and we lean that way, and you can keep pushing your team in that one direction, and then you kind of, yeah, it's a way of making your identity conscious, I guess, which seems to be a lot of what we end up talking about, way to make whatever we're talking about conscious.
Yeah, absolutely. It also maybe a practical point here as well. I think if you're in a coaching staff team in league, it might be useful. This is again out of the obvious playbook, but it might just be useful coming together as a staff at the beginning and bringing clips of what you think a term means. So,
Mm,
like, bring 3 clips of other teams doing the thing and share it with us as a coaching staff, so maybe 2, 3, 4 people, and we can each see visible evidence of what you think this term means, and if it's all the same, fantastic, but they're likely to be slight differences, and you can discuss through, like, what's the core concept we're actually after here. And once you've got that agreement, coherence, alignment amongst the coaching staff, it's just super easy to embed that within the team, or easier to be on the same page as a group of people with the players. So maybe that's already done, but I think having that pre-meet with the coaching staff
Mm,
helps, of course.
mm. Yeah.
So yeah, that was one point I think that was really, really great. And also we touched on the sort of simplicity and complexity in finding like triggers rather than getting too granular and reviewing everything, as you say, like you can review around those points. One other thing I thought was actually really nice to hear was how he approaches updates and changes to the game, because I think this is in a lot of the work I've done and a lot of the research I've done, it always is a stressor for coaches that the game changes and often changes significantly so often. And he spoke about the introduction of grubs and his process to approaching that. And I think just what he spoke about, um, just spending time thinking through what are the implications of this, and the way he articulated how now there's no hope of the support reaching level 6, so therefore that doesn't need to be a major concern, and actually the support can roam more on the map and la 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 as a consequence. And he got to that by just sitting there and thinking through it.
Mm,
And I just thought that really just really explained it well, and I got it.
mm,
So
mm.
I was really enjoyed hearing that. Don't know if
Yeah.
that resonated with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And even that, I think, is a good sign. Like people listening to it who aren't professional players got it. That's when you know you're at the right level. You can build the complexity up, but let's start with simplicity, because if you start complex, we might misunderstand each other and then you never get it back. Whereas if you start at simple, then you can build the complexity. Yeah, I think it's really, really good. And I think it shows again just the power of having a specific system of how you see the game. Because now it's like, okay, here's this new change. What does it affect? Because you
Yeah,
already were thinking in this clear terms of like, right, Herald was the most important objective. Therefore, one of the most important things was support had to be 6 for the objective so that we'd win the objective fight. Therefore, the support has to get as much XP so it can't roam. So as soon as you start
yeah,
changing those things, it doesn't make sense if you just were like, well, to play for Herald, we want the 730 push in bot. But because you didn't have that complicated system, you can't see how much that changes. It's not like, well, now we just want the one at whatever it is, a minute 30 before Herald now. That
yeah.
doesn't make sense either. So yeah, I think it's really, really good. And I love the kind of direct approach to it and actually doing it consciously again, which is
Mhm.
something that I've always tried to push, but I think is actually a little bit uncommon because it's very tempting, especially, something we might talk about in a bit is the credibility side of things. But especially when you're worried about that, if you're coming into a new team and there's new changes, which often coincide because of the new year, new changes
Mhm.
as you're joining a new team. And I'm, let's say, an unproven coach and I join a team that's maybe the best team that I've coached before, whatever level that might be. And I say, right, we're going to just always go for grubs because we need to see how they work. And the players are not really on board with that as an idea. And we start losing games because we're prioritizing grubs. It can get very messy very quickly. And you can sort of do some real long term damage to the relationship while trying to pursue things in the right way. So I
Yeah,
really love how he was talking about it. And also, actually, I hadn't really thought about it like this before, but I absolutely love his answer to, okay, but what if grubs don't become the most important objective? It wasn't my
yeah,
thinking, which was in the past, which is like, well, we should learn as much about them first. And then if they're not the most important, then we just still have that for later. And also completely agree with the idea that we're just playing for a topside objective. So any other topside objective, there will be crossover. But his thing was even more kind of simple than that. It's like they put this new thing in, they don't want them to be
yeah,
shit.
yeah,
so I know they'll buff them if they're not good enough, which they did.
yeah.
So I think that was absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was, I remember, like, was it at the end of last year? They changed the map. Like, they introduced,
Mm,
like, new new ways of
yeah.
moving around the map, and, like, new
Coming into
barriers and
this
new
year.
obstacles.
There's going to be a load of new changes again, new objectives, new
Gosh.
plants,
Yeah,
a dynamic objective that spawns on one side or the other side, which is going to be very interesting. I don't know if in pro play it will almost always spawn on one side, because it's about how much damage is done in a certain
yeah.
area. But that's interesting. I like this is a completely separate point. I like the dynamism, but I like the fact that this time they're letting you see it in advance.
Mhm.
I think when dragons first came into the game, like different types of dragons that were RNG, it was really, really silly. And some of them were way too strong as well. But also they were strong against specific comps, but you didn't know what was going to come. So I lost to game professional play because of the type of dragon. Because we had a
Yeah.
comp that's really bad against that type of dragon, and that's the type of dragon that came up.
Yeah.
Whereas this, they've started to do a thing where, okay, I can't remember exactly. At 10 minutes, you can see where it's going to spawn, and at 18 minutes, it spawns, or something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers, but you get a bit of warning, which is good. And you
Yeah.
can work out where it probably will spawn because it spawns not on random, but on where the most damage is done. That was a complete tangent, but anyway,
Well,
yeah.
it's interesting. You made me think about, are there, in most sports, in most sports, there isn't just like the game itself and the location doesn't usually work against you. But actually, I was thinking about playing rugby outside. Like if the wind is strong or it's
Mm,
raining, actually you are working against
yeah.
the elements.
Yeah.
That's a rugby. But no, it's nice that that is
Yeah.
like relatively
If you're
stable.
a if you're a Northern Hemisphere team, you're praying for rain quite often.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. So that was all fascinating and gave me some insights into how he thought about coaching the game and understanding the game and handling the difficulties there, which I thought was great. A lot of the things, one of the things that you both spoke about was just the credibility of not being a former player at
Mm,
high professional level. And he didn't dwell on this too long, but it was just I've been around long enough, and I've like my resume has been built up to the point where I now have what I say carry some weight in new situations. And I thought that was interesting, and I actually thought like I don't know many other ways right now in league that you have that buy-in without having been there and done that as a player or as a coach.
mm,
And it was just interesting to hear that once
yeah.
again, that that was the kind of thing that he needed to rely on to get
Mm.
the buy-in.
And I think this is why, I mean, we will talk about the other side later, but this is why I spend so much time, or people, I guess, like us, spend so much time talking about the more horizontal or more democratic style of
Mm.
coaching,
Yeah.
because the system filters for the opposite. Because the other way to get buy-in, even though I would argue it's incredibly fake buy-in, is to just come in and be 100% sure about stuff. Like this is what we're going to do. This is what you just did there is wrong. Like do this instead. All that kind of thing. And because there's such short time frames in ERLs, because so much of decisions around rosters, even in professional organizations, even in organizations that have been around a long time, is still really done by the players, whether the org would say that or not.
Mhm.
You end up in this situation where the people who will just act super confidently about the game are the people who get listened to in the short term. And because everything is so short term, they get the better team, which means they get a better CV and results, as we talked about last time, at 90+% of how you get jobs. So they then get the better job and they might well move to the next job again later because they've been removed, but it's
That's a
one of
great
those.
point.
It happens a lot. Like I say, it's a self-filtering system, and so players think that's what good coaching is because that's the coaches who've had the kind of impact on them, and then coaches think that's the way that you should coach because that's how you do it. Either you're even people who are like former players, you have to just be super confident about the game,
Mm.
which is kind of crazy. I mean, the thing with former players is a strange one, and I think it shows how much I would say, misunderstand the role of a coach, where you're much more likely to get a good job having been a player, let's say in the LFL. Uh, you're much more likely to get a job straight away coaching in the LFL than if you've been coaching for 5 years in other leagues and done well, which is fine. I think players can make incredible coaches, the right
Yeah.
players. And I think people who then look into coaching can often make the absolute best coaches, but that's a
Yeah.
separate point because really
Well, that's it. There's
the only thing you know for sure about a player in that situation is they're not good enough to play now at this level. So that's their only
well,
kind of
this
qualifying factor to be in the situation that they're in.
yeah, I mean, uh, you've mentioned something really important there, just the luck factor. Like if you happen to be on a great team, you could well have been carried, like, through
Mm,
the entire process.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you maybe you were the right piece, but you weren't, some people talk about, I had competitive success, I was the IGL.
mm,
Okay, that's your word. Who knows,
yeah,
really? Like, you had your coaching credentials are assumed by association with a successful team, and
Mm.
it could just be the right set of pieces, and everyone had equal share, or even you had less share of it. So like, it's yeah, you're really. I know there aren't many clear-cut ways of really understanding or evaluating coaching competence in esports at the moment, but it's the amount of the assurance we have in a former successful player
Mm.
as being a good coach is it is interesting because of the degree of luck involved.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and there's all that luck with the the coaches as well, I guess, or maybe even more so because there's coaches who don't have a particularly large impact on rosters, either positive or negative, and there's teams who got results in spite of what some of their staff members did, and then the staff member progresses to a better org because of the results, and it's a strange situation, but it's also something where we're not forgiving enough with it, I think, as well. I think it was actually you who was speaking about on when we did our coach talk episode about with Phil Jackson in his one of his books talking about his career. There's times where he's
Like
talking
me.
about a season where he's just like, I didn't have the right players or like didn't have the right setup or something. It's just like really short, just like that one just ignore like that just happened, you know. That's just luck, but bad luck, that one.
Right.
And then like, okay, but we don't ever do that in esports. You're as good as your last results. So if you were really successful in different organizations and then you join a new org and you're not the right coach for that group, like we spoke about last time, and you have a really terrible result, sometimes that can be it. And
Yeah.
you might well be good for 9 out of the other 10 teams, but because you happen to pick the wrong one, um, that can be it. So I do think credibility is a massive thing to think about and to worry about. And people like myself or like Duffman who've never played the game like competitively, and I mean, well, technically I have, but only because I had to sub in a few times. But that was a long, long time ago. I don't even play the game. I don't know how you'd say like uncompetitively. I don't even play the game to try and
Recreationally?
climb like in solo queue. I
Yeah.
haven't since I've been doing esports professionally, which is what 5 6 years now or something like that. So I used to, but just for fun to see how high I could get. And then now I don't even do that. So
Yeah.
I don't think I think I might have had 5 solo queue games in the last 5 years. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting to think about that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
What happens
On
in a
just
sport context? Or sorry, you'd
well,
say your
actually,
point first, but then as well as that, I'd be interested.
I have experience of it in an esports context, like in a professional League of Legends context. I have an experience of um, coaches being questioned, not directly, like casual conversations I picked up on, and in talks with me, coaches being questioned about their game knowledge and things like that, and actually occasionally the comments are like, he doesn't play the game, or this person doesn't play the game, therefore how can they know what's good for me or good for us as a team? And I do think there is some responsibility on the coach to show that you are putting the effort in. I think that's fair. However, there are other ways to do it, and I think even just making it known to the team, all of that although all those unseen hours of studying, scouting, watching VODs from other teams, like making it known that that's being done, can create just as much buy-in, if not more, than just playing the game. Because I think we all know the problems with playing in solo queue and how that can affect us, and we all know that we're not always in the most constructive mindset in those situations. So playing a lot of solo queue as a coach is probably not a surefire way of developing game knowledge that's useful within the team context. But you can still show that you're investing thought in it, and create buy-in by showing your effort there, by saying, I've watched 20 VODs from different leagues around the planet. These are my core takeaways, and I think that can create the same level of buy-in. So I don't think I
Mm.
fully agree with you. You shouldn't need to demonstrate a high game rank
Yeah,
to be able to add value.
yeah. I think yeah. The thing that I would say, and again, I'm sort of speaking or a theoretical context and putting aside what actually you need to do, because playing solo queue games, if you were challenger for example, or you could get grandmaster, would actually probably increase how much people listen to you on the team. But if I'm looking at it, if I'm just a head of coaching somewhere, I think or would say to my coaches, okay, if you're forgetting individual coaching, but if you're a team coach, a strategic coach, or especially a head coach, sure, you can play the game, but don't call it work. Like you can play the game on your free time. It's the same as I always thought with managers used to just watch scrims. And it's like, okay, you can watch scrims, sure, like no problem, but you're not adding anything. So you're watching scrims is fun,
Yeah.
right? And then work in the evening and you watch scrims during the day because that's fun or funner than working in the day and watching Netflix in the evening. And so I
Right.
think it's better than probably better than doing something completely different. Might not actually be, but that's a separate point. But it's definitely not something that should be considered as like as good as analyzing a game. I even think about it for analyzing games as well for myself. If I'm
Mm.
watching the LEC on the weekend and I'm sitting down with my wife and having a drink and watching the LEC, that's not work. Like, yes, I'm coaching League of Legends, and yes, I might pick some things
There's an
up,
overlap, but
but that's not.
yeah.
I'm not calling that work. Like, I'm doing that for fun, and I'm specifically doing it for fun. If I'm watching it by myself, I'm probably using the raffle file rather than the game. I'm pausing it. I'm going back. I'm actually
Mhm.
making notes. I'm doing all that kind of thing, and trying to build up that distinction, which I think is good. And Duke has a phrase which I absolutely loved. It's not what makes you win; it's what makes you busy playing solo queue games. And so you can say like, "Oh, I'm
That's
working
great.
like I work like 15-hour days, so like I'm putting in everything." And it's like you do
Yeah.
scrims and then you play lots of a computer game. It's like
Yeah.
this is not. It's what makes you busy.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Um, to the sports example, my personal experience in basketball as fairly high level coach and moderate level player, um, I actually think there is maybe even some ageism
Mm,
in basketball or maybe other traditional sports where if you are if you are still playing a lot, you're probably on the younger side of the
mm,
coaching sort of spectrum, and as a consequence, I think players might treat you as another kind of player, and you haven't accrued the knowledge over years of coaching. And I actually think there might even be some ageism where if your coach is generation or two older than you, you might you might just my own very like narrow experience of this. I think you might assume that they have a
mm.
greater amount of
Uh,
knowledge. So
yeah,
I don't know if esports will ever
it
get there,
it can
or
also.
if it
I
should.
also think it's quite different in esports because it can also be part of the narrative that you tell yourself in a way. If you're a player and you're 20s and your coach is in their 40s or 50s, then you have a very easy narrative of like, okay, they know loads about it, but I know why they're not playing because physically they
Right.
can't anymore. So it's never the question of like, oh, if you're so good, why don't you do it? Whereas in League of Legends, especially as most people are roughly the same age as players anyway, or maybe a little bit older, but even if
Good
you are
point.
30s, okay, if you're so good at the game and you're so high elo, why aren't you playing?
Yeah.
Because
Good point.
we all know in a lot of those situations you're not playing because you're not good enough. And the coaches who probably never really wanted to play also probably are more likely to be the coaches who are never really high elo or anything like that. So it does make things a little easier, I think, when you
Mm.
have that. Say there's just a physical barrier why that person can't play. But even in sport, I mean, Mourinho is very famous for sort of, at least maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know football well enough. But he's like the one manager I know who wasn't a professional player, and that was a real struggle. And even when he only managed to become a manager because he was at Porto for so long and gradually worked his way up. And even then, after he did incredibly well with them, he still had to prove himself at every stage. Maybe that's how he built his personality to be what it is. But
Yeah.
it's still super rare, And it's like, well, I can just tell myself, well, Guardiola would play if it was whatever it is 30 years ago, he'd be playing, so that's fine. And that's why
Well,
he's not now, and that's why I'm happy to listen to him as a coach. So even though
yeah.
it's never actually the case, like it's never, well, not never, it's very rarely the case that the best players make the best coaches. There's a lot of people who coaching career is far more successful than their playing career, but apparently the fact that they had a playing career is a useful thing,
Yeah.
even if it wasn't, at that level, which is
Yeah.
really really strange.
I don't think it's never going to go away in sport or esport. I think it's never going to go away the fact that you haven't experienced what I've experienced, therefore you can't
Mm,
give me anything useful. I don't think that's ever going to go anywhere because it works in so many fields.
mm,
So I think academia, for example, if you're a professor, and I'm an aspiring professor. I don't think I am, but if you would be, like, sure, I'd listen to the professor about their experience. I'm sure, I'm more certain that would help. But the difference in sport and e-sport is it's such an uncertain, changing like context. The experience of playing professional league now is different than it was 5 years
Mm,
ago,
mm,
and so the professional playing experience 5 years ago has little bearing on how we should do things now, especially as we discover new ways of training and
mm.
new benefits to different types of training, and the
Yeah,
multiplayer practice tools coming in. So, well,
yeah,
hopefully.
yeah,
So, okay, in that case, it's a brand new landscape.
yeah.
So,
And I mean, at some point, we should talk about how to hire, or how we think you should hire coaches, because again, is so difficult because the same thing happens with coaches. Like if you're not keeping up to date on coaching, then your previous experience, it doesn't mean nothing. But if you're not staying up to date, then it reminds me of a thing in Scrubs. It's talking about medicine, and there's a thing with an old doctor who eventually gets fired, and he complains that it's just because he's old, and the person who's firing him, who's also old, is like, no, it's about staying current. If you graduated med school 2 years ago, half of what you know is out of date, so you need to stay
right.
current. It's the same in coaching. So a few
Yeah.
years ago, I was this successful team. Also now might not, now we've got multiplayer practice till next year. Maybe suddenly 90% of what you do is that, and we're all starting again
Yeah.
from scratch. And that's why,
Yeah.
again, it's so important to be constantly learning.
Yeah. Exactly as you say. That's yeah. Coach learning is so central to it. Just if anyone wants to pursue a really good example of a non-former player making it big as a coach, Eric Spoelstra of the Miami Heat in the NBA. He started his journey as I think, a video analyst in their sort of scouting department, um, around his early 30s or even late 20s, and he became their head coach and won a few championships. The caveat is he did have the best player in the world, arguably ever. However, it does make you think there are other skills that you learn, and just think about like video analysis. Much like Duffman, is like that analytical approach probably stands you in good stead to be a
Mm,
great coach
mm,
at some level. So
yeah.
anyway,
The last thing that I would say on this that I always give as advice, which is kind of hard maybe to talk about unless there's concrete examples, but maybe it makes sense. I think a really important one for me is thinking about where you want to place your credibility, or where you want to tap it from, I guess maybe is a better way of thinking about it. And it's something that I think Jocko Willink talks about a lot with, like, your leadership capital is what the words he uses. Like be very cautious and also conscious of where you're putting that. And what I do personally, as someone who, like I say, is not very good at the game, um, is I never want to make it seem, even for a second, like I'm saying I'm going to be useful to you as a coach because I know so much
mm,
about League of Legends. So as it so happens, I don't think I have any problems with knowledge about the game. I don't never work with a player that I couldn't help in the game, and definitely never work with any teams that I couldn't help in the game substantially. But it wouldn't matter. And maybe I say that knowing that I have it to fall back on. Maybe that's like a bias where if you didn't have it to fall back on, if you didn't have a clear system of how you saw the game, and if you weren't confident in it, then I wouldn't be able to do it. But I just try and never position it like that. So the goal is that no one ever thinks John is a useful head coach to us because he knows that this build does 2% more damage than this other build. It's like, no, it's not about that, and it never should be. So I think
mm,
it's important to be specific around that, because if you aren't conscious with it, it's very easy to fall into that trap of I'm good because I know things about the game. I remember, as an example from way back in the day, I think maybe sort of season three, Jesus, 11 years ago. There was a player, Reapert, who was a fantastic player, one of the best players in the world in Korea, who's then came into coaching. He's now been coaching for a long time and been very successful in North America coaching. But the first time he came to a team, Cloud9, to coach, they recorded it because they were doing a behind the scenes thing. And I think he walks into the room, and I'm pretty sure the first thing that happens is their AD carry starts quizzing him about the details of the fifth and sixth item of his build in the last scrim. Like, oh, I went Bloodthirster here. Do you think I should have gone GA or Bloodthirster? And if so, like, why? And it's like, it's so quickly like, boom, 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 like this is like, prove yourself to me.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, like jump through this hoop for me now.
yeah. It's
Um,
mad.
but yeah, so I think it's worth being very conscious about that and very careful about that. And I think it does apply to other coaches as well. So if you're a performance coach or a nutritionist or something like that, it's worth bearing in mind that you should be conscious with this, because I think I've seen that mistake in the past as well, where people are left with the impression of like, I will be a good performance coach for you if you feel better about yourself and you think you're getting fitter or something, which might happen a long time from now, in which case maybe it's too late. Or like, my nutritional advice is valuable because you'll instantly wake up tomorrow feeling better, or you won't lose as many games or something like that. Like, so just being very cautious about that and being very clear and open about the expectations and the way it's going to work and all that kind of thing, I think is very useful.
Yeah. There's a funny one as well about the performance coaching. Yeah, about personal health and physical strength and being able to tell other people how to train, requiring you to be Superman.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah. That
so
helps.
yeah,
As like, that is actually a good equivalent. We had
it's yeah, it would be
yeah,
mad, yeah.
we did some work at some point with this company when I was working at Excel. And I think one of the reasons why people were quite excited about it is because the two guys came in and they were like just in unbelievable shape. And so it's like, okay, sure, yeah, I'll do this weird like test thing that this
Whatever you
new
say.
test. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I do think that matters. I know there's a piece that Clive Woodward talked about where he wanted to do, I can't remember if it was like yoga or aerobics or something with the England rugby team, which already sounds difficult. But remember, this is like 2000, so way more difficult. And so he's like, I wanted to find a really attractive yoga teacher so that they would actually come and do it, and so that they would all turn up on time. And it apparently worked really, really well. So it's worth thinking about. Not
Yeah,
necessarily that would apply to your League of Legends knowledge, but interesting.
absolutely. It makes it all harder in like remote coaching too.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't
You
show
could
off
put
all my
a
Ironman
yeah,
medals.
can't show off my six pack on camera as subtly.
Yeah. Okay, what other points did I take away? I think so. We've touched on building shared understanding around concepts, about uh, just spending time thinking through the implications of changes to the game, the issue of sort of credibility as a non-player, and how that gets easier over time as you build up your sort of resume of coaching there. The idea of triggers, things like that, to balance the complexity of the game, and find things to evaluate and coach. Um, there's a few things about the fundamentals of coaching that Duffman
Fundamentals of
mentioned
league.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah, about it comes down to waves and logic, and
Mm.
the strong takeaway for me was that this is a logical person who thinks things through, and conveys
Step
them
by
in very
step. Yeah.
step-by-step, graspable, transferable
Mm.
ways. I love the point about we're not. I think it was even the title of the episode. We're not looking to play on equal footing.
Yeah,
We're
give them a
trying to
fair
find
fight. I like that.
advantages. Yeah,
Yeah.
and actually, a colleague, Dr. Michael Trotter, introduced me to some work that looks at sport from the perspective of like superiorities. So where are we on the playing field superior in some way, and what
Mm.
can we exploit?
Mm.
I think that's a really fun. We don't need to dive into it today. It is just something fun to look at and think about.
Mm.
How can we detect a slight advantage? How can we snowball it?
Yeah.
That kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. I
I think
love that kind of thing. And I think I actually do think that kind of vocabulary is really useful as well. Something I should have done more with the last team that I was coaching and only did little is we used to talk about like cycles, so we wouldn't talk about waves. So we're grouping the waves again, finding that complexity, simplicity, balance. And here's the way we approach the first cycle. We're going to do this and this. It's going to be very consistent every time. It's not that we have to do the same play, but we think about the same things. And then in the second cycle, the main thing was like, how are we going to take that advantage and beat them to death with it? Which I actually think is would have been a better way to phrase it than like, how are we going to snowball this advantage or increase our
Okay.
advantage? It's like build up some emotion to the thing. Like
Yeah.
we're not giving them a fair fight.
Yeah.
I like that as an idea, and you can be sort of saying that to each other when you're behind, and be like, we're just going to give them nothing fairly. And people talk I don't know if they use it, but people talk about G2 sometimes in a really nice way where I say when they get behind, they just ask you so many questions. Like, okay, what are you going to do if I just stay? Like
Duffman, yeah.
caps on the side, just like, what are you going to do if I just stay an extra wave that I'm not supposed to stay for? And then you have to like, okay, we have to actually just 1v2 him, even though he's strong. And then you're all like, yeah, but it's caps. And then suddenly you're just playing these games with people where it's just a lot more difficult um, to win than it should be. And again, I think it's better to talk about it in this emotive language of like we should become a team that's like people hate trying to actually beat or something like that, so you start maybe find the point analytically, but then don't be afraid to add some emotion to how you describe it. And I love that, like no fair
Great point.
fights. Like we don't give them something on equal footing. Like we're just annoying.
Yeah,
And-
yeah, great point. I love that. Yeah, using emotive language to fire people up to do that. And actually, you immediately made me think of like old history lessons I used to have in school, where people talk about, medieval armies searching for upper ground and things like that. Like, there's probably an Art of War quote in there somewhere.
Mm,
Um, yeah, but and it makes you the way he phrased it, the way you put it there about using the emotional language, it fires you up to really think about it. Like in a
yeah,
competitive situation,
yeah,
what can you bring to the table and use more of
mm,
and use to your advantage and
yeah,
disrupt the opponent,
mm.
which is really, I guess, the whole point, isn't it? That's the whole point of competition.
Yeah, and then you can sort of celebrate it and build off that and keep
Yeah,
snowballing the same thing of like, look here, they really wanted this fight and we just didn't give it to them. And we got this and this instead.
yeah,
And you've seen teams in Europe, especially, fall apart to that play style of G2 just over and over again. And it looks like,
yeah,
how do we do this, guys? How do we stop them? Just how do we force them to play fair? And they never will.
yeah.
And I think that's such a great thing to buy into.
I've got a rugby one for you, actually. I think a rugby anecdote. I was talking to a researcher recently who was working with rugby and like rugby pedagogy in the UK, and they introduced a whole initiative way of coaching called Beat the Game,
Okay.
and where the sort of coach would throw out an idea, and the players would. The idea was that they weren't necessarily playing against each other; they were trying to win the game. So
Mm,
um, one of them was, I think, they introduced the idea of don't get tackled. So as a consequence, you can imagine the players sort of passed the ball very quickly, very early, and that translated into the game where essentially they exhausted opponents because they had trained so hard to just stay away from
mm,
tackles. And
mm,
the game remained fast,
mm,
and they were doing things that maybe weren't traditionally seen as the done thing. So running backwards, evading tackles by running backwards, and
mm,
ceding territory. But actually, it had this effect of knackering opponents and
mm.
I thought that was really, really interesting. So I could see some, that your advantage in that situation was physical fitness, speed,
Yeah,
tiring out the opponent, and then just keeping to doing that
yeah,
being an advantage.
and I think you can do so much around that, around practice as well. Reminds me of not quite the same, but for the All Blacks, they had this period where they were the best team in the world, and they would never do that well at World Cups. They had a very famous defeat to France, I think it was. And then after that, when they were about to go on and win back to back, one of the things that they changed, as well as bringing in sports psychologists and stuff like that, and working a lot with a guy called Dr. Kerry Evans, who's I think his stuff is fantastic. But they also wanted to do this thing where we're going to make practice harder than the games.
Yeah,
And they did it for firstly the intensity as well, but also apparently the coaches would just be completely unfair to them. And they have a ref during their practice game of the week, and they tell the ref, "All right, I want you to send off the captain in the first 10 minutes. Just find an excuse to send him off." And it's like a just completely unfair decision that's roughly sort of grounded in some rule. And it's like, okay, what are you going to do? Are you going to be angry about it? Are you going to be upset about it? But also, like, how are you going to continue to make this game difficult for the opposition, even if the opposition is just the rest of the squad, and you just be really biased against the team that so that they can gradually build up that resilience of okay, how are we going to get ourselves out of this situation? And I think it's
yeah,
becoming more and more common, and to the point where I actually think maybe we should sometimes go the other way. But this idea of like never surrendering in practice,
mm,
I think is a great one. I don't think we should lose slowly because I do think that can be silly as well. But we had a rule which I love, which is just we don't surrender, we just add more and more chaos in. So
Yeah.
if we're behind and we don't outscale, it's like, okay, we're going to do something crazy. And if it doesn't work, we're going to do something more crazy and more crazy and more crazy. And you probably end the game in a couple of minutes because you just lose really quickly.
Right.
But that's fine because it's better than just FFing, because you
Yeah.
build up that resilience of like, now we're behind in the game, or something really silly goes wrong right at the beginning. Either something like they invade us, which we didn't see coming, and suddenly we're playing really far behind, or even something that's more silly, like you're jungling and you reset one of the camps, and now suddenly you're 15 seconds slower. Like, okay, how are we gonna
Yeah.
deal with this, and how are we gonna like keep adapting to it? And I think that that kind of thing is really good,
Yeah.
and I think it's much more productive, bringing it back to the Duffman thing, it's much more productive and much easier to do that when you have this kind of idea that we can all grasp onto. So, okay, whenever we're behind, we are never giving them a fair fight. Or actually, forget that. Forget the when we're behind, because when we're ahead, the fight's not fair anyway. So we're just never going to give
Yeah.
them a fair fight. And it's like, okay, fine, they're really ahead because something bad went wrong. So how are we going to not play this game fair?
Yeah. I've always loved that and admired that. I saw you do that, introducing the sort of no FF rule and this idea of we're losing. Well, let's go and lose the game then. Let's lose the game. Let's really
Yeah.
let's see what's possible, and maybe we lose it instantly, but we're not quitting. Like
Mm.
there's always a chance. Which
Yeah.
and why not use that time for experimentation and creativity? I love that in your approach for sure.
And I like actually. It reminds me of just other things and other conversations that I've had over the years. I do think it's also really important to just kind of make people prove it, which again is something that came up in a
Yeah.
slightly different situation with Duffman, where he's like, okay, most people play this way, and then most people just group up because it's time to group up because it's Dragon. And if he's not sure from the scouting whether this team will do it or not, he's just going to assume they will. And it's
Mhm.
kind of like that idea of like, okay, make them prove that they can play on side lanes before we respect them enough to do it. I
Yeah.
think that's really, really good. And maybe it wouldn't be the case now, but we won a bunch of games again, huge long time ago, from when lane swaps were a thing, like every single game, very different from they were now, much less complicated, much more simple. But they were super rare. They were happening in pro play when there wasn't like an LEC. And so I was teaching a bunch of teams to do lane swaps, and that became basically the only thing you did every time as a coach. You were just teaching lane swaps. And we used to do things that were incorrect at the professional level, but definitely won us games. And so the big thing was that you would never go to the tower and you would double jungle, because at that point you split jungle, XP. And if you went to top lane tower in IEM, or maybe it was the first season of LEC, in professional game, you would get dove every single time. And but then we said, well, okay, we're not in the professional level, we're in the ERLs. So dive us. Like next time, then we'll respect you. But this time you have to prove it, prove that you can do it. And no one ever could, because they weren't expecting you to be there because no
No.
one's there. It's that kind of idea of how can we just intentionally lean into this idea of making the game difficult for the opponent.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
so fun to be a part of as a player and as a coach that it becomes a lot easier than following what everyone else is doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Hats off to you for that. Awesome. Really cool approach. So, the only other thing I really noted from Duffman's interview, a few bits about being authentic to who he is, was also mention of the word democratic. And I think we wanted to get into a
Mm,
chat about democratic approaches,
mm.
autocratic, hierarchical,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
It's,
horizontal.
I always say, I don't know if this is true. I don't know if there is actually difference, but what I always say, and I think I said in the interview, is for me, it's one of those things where whatever terminology you first heard used to describe this issue, that's the one that sort of sticks with you. So the first one that I heard was vertical and horizontal. So I don't know if I think those words are better because I have used them for a long time or because they actually are. But firstly, from just from your point of view, is there a difference if I'm saying I have a very vertical approach as a coach and you say, okay, I have a very dictatorial approach as a coach or a very hierarchical approach as a coach? Is it all talking about the same thing? I'm coming back to shared language and concepts. Are these things the same or are they actually different from a technical point of view?
S- I would slightly dodge
Okay.
the question, and I'll try and lay out some thoughts that I've had about this. Um, Again, caveat, not based on reading and research, so standing on the shoulders of giants, not all my ideas, but it sort of depends on what field you read into, I think. So management has a different view of things to sport coaching, and political science, which has been really informative to my thinking, has another view of things. I think in sport coaching, I've rarely seen vertical. No, horizontal. I've rarely seen horizontal used, and
Mm.
vertical I've maybe seen a few times, but usually they talk about hierarchical as being there's a hierarchy within teams, sport coach or head coach at the top, players below. And th- as a consequence, there's been a history of research that looks at the things like there was a survey or a scale produced called the leadership scale for sport, and it had 5 different factors that it was analyzing. But a lot of it, two of the main ones were um, democratic behaviors and autocratic behaviors. And autocratic was sort of this coach sits at the top of the hierarchy,
Mm.
and democratic was more. It's not so much of a straight line.
Mm.
It's more of a cluster, and there are decisions made within the group. And I also like horizontal and vertical because it gives you like it evokes a very clear understanding of where you see yourself in relation to others.
Yeah.
So that comes through. Before I go any further, like you, any where did horizontal and vertical come from for you?
I actually can't remember. I can't remember originally, but the problem is that now I've done that. Now every time I've read any of these words, I just translate it in my head to the the words that I use
Yeah.
instead. As I mentioned to you earlier before we started recording, one of the reasons that I like horizontal and vertical is because democratic is a word that means a specific thing. So when I'm
Mhm.
talking about horizontal and vertical, what I'm kind of really talking about, I want it to be less binary, where it's like this is maybe 90% a horizontal situation, and this is whatever. We don't have to put numbers to it, but my point is that as soon as you say democratic, the downside of that is like, okay, so that means you're running it like a democracy, so everyone has an equal voice, which is probably not quite the case, but
Yeah.
it might be. It's not going to be. We don't even have to get into the problems with democracies and is there an equal voice in any democracy? But
Well,
the but yeah, it's much more weighted.
that's I mean, that's exactly the issue. With my reading of democracy and reading into literature away from sport coaching, it's really challenging to think about. I think Duffman wasn't wrong to say to use the term, and I think in coaching it does represent or convey this idea of I involve my group in decisions. It conveys that idea, but actually, if we really like think it through, push it to its end point, there are different types of democracies. So is it really going to be like a
Representative
true
democracy or
yeah?
yeah.
It's going to be like we don't move forward unless everyone has a say on
Mm.
everything,
Mm.
and rarely in a team, a
Mm.
competitive team, is that the case because actually there will be a leader, there will be a role through like who has more of a say in the leadership process. So, for example, even what are we going to be all voting on?
Yeah.
There is going to be a figure through which the leadership power is channeled to bring that to table and make that decision. So, it's kind of that's one way of thinking about it, and some of the problems there where people think that democratic is automatically assuming we're leaderless,
Mm.
and that everyone is maybe horizontal. Maybe they think when we
Mm.
talk about democracy, when actually it suggests there is somebody making a decision.
Yeah.
The other terms I've seen things like distributed leadership,
Mm.
which is really interesting, where leadership isn't held leadership power isn't held within
Mm.
one individual.
Mm.
It's distributed, and you can do things like having sub-teams within your team that are responsible for certain things.
Mm.
You can talk about athlete leaders, like a team captain, for example, so you can see that it's distributed. But that's an interesting one as well because that can be hierarchical,
Yeah.
because you can have someone at the top
Yeah.
delegating and deciding who has responsibility for what, and yet they can also have a say in the leadership. So
Yeah.
it's awfully confusing. There's a
That
lot out there.
that I mean reminds me of the Navy SEALs or even like the Toyota way kind of idea. Toyota's big thing of anyone on the production line has a button to fully halt the entire production line was
Right.
this revolutionary idea. It's like, yeah, of course they're not on the same level as the manager, but it is still distributed leadership of like you're empowered to stop everything if you think
Yeah.
it's the right decision. And the SEALs are the same. They have obviously the army, they're still quite hierarchical or within that realm.
Mhm.
But they're very famous for being different than other special forces, even by the amount of power each person has, and
Yeah,
each person can make calls and override calls and all that kind of thing. Um, so for
that's
me, I think
really good.
one of the things that I saw early on was like the sort of Tenenbaum Smith model of management. I think so that's more management than coaching. But I think maybe that was even that. I think if you Google it, there'll be 5 different diagrams, one of which uses democratic and dictatorial, one of which uses horizontal. You know, there'll be all the words anyway on that same thing. Um, but the thing for me that I think is what I always would tell people is I think it's better to think about it in terms of situations rather than a static sort of thing. Now, of course, the situations will add up to your overall approach, but it's more okay, where do I want to give certain things and where do I want to not? And in a sport context, we can come on to some of the benefits of a more dictatorial and vertical way in a bit. But in a sport context, you'll probably never have an entirely horizontal situation even.
No.
Actually, well, you might, I would say, in a one-on-one with a player where you're more there for support and wellness and checking on what's going on. That's a perfect situation to just say, look, I'm not here to fix your problem. If there's a problem going on in your personal life, I'm here entirely on the same level as you, with nothing that I need to come out of this talk just to listen, basically. So I mean that maybe you could say is a purely horizontal situation, which doesn't happen anywhere near enough in esports. But I think almost always there's something, and I think the thing that I like to do with people is to sort of try and build up that toolkit in both situations. Now, for me, it was much harder to build up the toolkit in a vertical situation. Actually, the reason I got into doing a lot of content, but we can we can get onto that later or never. Um, and it was more easy to do the more horizontal stuff. I think for the same reasons that Duffman was talking about. And I would talk about, okay, I'm going to frame the discussion and I'm going to conclude the
Mhm.
discussion. And I say it like that. I'm not going to come with a conclusion necessarily, but I'm going to conclude the discussion. And the tighter the framing, the more vertical it is, but I'm still just going to provide the framing. And so if we talk about in reviews, for example, which is, I think, one of the best uses for this kind of thing, is that I'm not just going to show you a play and say, this is what you did wrong and this is what you should do. But I'm also not just going to show you a play silently. I'm going to say, remember, we were talking about how we're maximizing tempo, and I want to show you this thing. And then we can look at it, and they're already thinking about it with that frame of mind. They're not thinking about how I played that trade. They're thinking about where I moved and how I synced up with the other people on my team. And then maybe there's a discussion, and maybe someone else comes up with a great conclusion that sums it up perfectly. Then I just basically repeat that. So that's a fantastic one. So for next time, we need to make sure that we're doing this and this and this, or
Yeah.
if that's what they said, and it's not my conclusion, but I'm providing the frame, and then I'm taking it forward for all of us. And I think from the way that he was speaking, that's a lot of what Duffman was talking about. Same with the terminology. So this is a thing that happened, but we couldn't find a good way to speak about it. Then we let everyone else talk, and maybe one of the players comes up with the perfect word, or maybe no one comes up with a perfect word, and we can step in and say, "How about this word? Like
Yeah.
maybe we call this. Maybe is this kind of thing." And then once
Yeah.
everyone agrees, then you're enforcing it in the future because now you say, "Right, we agreed we would do this thing," or when we're ahead, we're going to play like this. Therefore, again, coming back to the credibility thing, that means it's got nothing to do with me. This is probably the main way I shift the credibility around and make it not about how much I know about the game.
Mhm.
Because it's not I said we'd do this, it's we said we would play dragon fights like this when we were ahead, and we are not
Yeah.
doing it. So yeah, that's kind of how I like to think about it, and why I like maybe those less concrete words that don't mean a different thing. And there's obviously so much weight where, especially people in the West, would say democratic obviously appeals to us probably more than dictatorial, even if we don't know any other context just from the words themselves.
Yeah. I would say you're right. It appeals. I think it aligns with what we like to think are our societal values. You've hit the nail on the head as far as I can tell and read into it, though. It's there. There is no one approach that's going to work in every situation. You will need to use different styles of leadership at different points, and we should think probably more in our coaching in general. There are probably coaches that are very good at this, but we should think more about the power that we have and how we exercise that power. So even your example of it being horizontal, if you go into a sort of health and well-being setting, are you commanding that person to turn up at that time and have that talk with you? Are you have you decided that we need that specialist involved in the team and that some of their time should be devoted to it? You are exercising power there, so it won't be completely horizontal,
Mm.
in that respect. So, but there will be times where it's necessary to do that, and it won't. You can't really call it wrong or right. It's
Yeah.
just there are times when you might be democratic, but actually you might be largely democratic, but there'll be other situations where it's more autocratic. And I think we've spoken before about having non-negotiables. I
Mm.
mean, you can say that we've arrived at non-negotiables as a team
Mhm.
democratically. I will then enforce them autocratically.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we are sticking to these from
Yeah.
now on. And if I
Yeah.
see you slip up, you're going to be
Yeah.
told about it.
Uh,
So I think that's the game of
mm.
coaching. You are likely to use a whole spectrum of different behaviors that don't fit into one leadership style.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that as well. Well, no, go ahead. Something
No,
on
no,
that?
I was gonna say as well, even if you're in a situation where you're trying to be as horizontal as possible, the player has even said that they want this talk with you. They're the one picking the time, they're the one picking the place, whatever. You also shouldn't forget that there's this stuff going on behind the scenes anyway. There's always power games or not, maybe not power games is the wrong word, but there's always power dynamics going on behind
Yeah,
everything we do. So if you're the head coach, especially at the end of the day, you can probably fire this person.
yeah,
So it's never going to be an equal situation. Doesn't matter what you
yeah,
do, it will never actually truly be equal, whether either of you would ever consciously think that. There's no way they would say the same thing to you as to someone who um, isn't isn't part of the team. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so useful to have people who are sports psychologists who are not also the performance coach with a team.
mm,
Because if you're there all the time, if you're here as an outsider, it's very different power dynamics. And I think it's much better for those situations to be fully horizontal as we can be. And it's like, I'm not going to tell people who could decide about your job the things you're going to tell me. And I don't decide about your job. And I'm from the outside and I haven't seen you all day and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's just really interesting to to think about.
absolutely. And a very contemporary conversation to have as well. So, sports coaching research, I mentioned that leadership scale for sport, which is a really interesting read because it talks about aspects of sort of social support perceived by players, training and instruction behavior, and then these leadership styles of autocratic and democratic, which are by no means all of them, but it talks about that. But that scale has been used in quite well research that's probably not so contemporary, should we put it? And it's been associated with preferences. So the researcher utilize that scale has at times come up with research that suggested that higher, more elite players want a more autocratic approach, coaching approach, and that individual sport athletes might want a more democratic approach, and things like that.
Mm.
But is that really useful?
Yeah,
Because
and
we
also is
no,
that
we
just
can't.
changing? Because I was as soon as you said
Yeah,
that, I thought, well, previous generations might have wanted more autocratic,
true.
and they're now better because they've been doing it for longer.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So I don't think it's I think it's a useful scale to be aware of, but I think that the research is catching up now to this idea that it's probably a bit of everything in different degrees at different points in different situations. So um, yeah, it's really interesting. However, that being said, generally I would be in favour of if the needs of your team are aligned with this, I do think that giving players at least a sense that they can have some decision making power is usually a good thing.
Hmm.
I really like this idea of having distributed leadership that's formalized into even just working groups. Like this month, support. You're going to have one other player, and you're going to work through a problem and bring it back to us. Like, yes, it's kind of controlling in a sense, but also you're giving some leadership that you'll then try and implement there from their direction. I think that kind of stuff is really fun and healthy and is almost a relief for the coach sometimes to take some of the decision making pressure off them. So
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's really good. So before we get on to the last bit, what if I asked you? This is probably an impossible question. What are the benefits of a democratic style of coaching? So we talked before about this motivation thing. I think that's a big one.
Mhm.
But from your point of view, and you just mentioned there, like giving them some sort of ownership can actually be fun. As we said, that again ties back into the motivation because the more motivated you are, the more fun you find these kind of things as well. So, what are the other things that come to mind? And I'll see if they align with the stuff that I would say as well.
Um, so probably you've touched on this. If you work from the bottom up in a system that where decisions will be made, usually at the bottom we've got a more accurate feeling for the what's going on. And so decisions that are made with that information will probably be very relevant and impactful. So you can think in league, you've got players who have played their lane and they've concentrated on that for 45 minutes of the game. You as a coach will have glanced across lanes and other areas of the map. So if you're listening to the players, they are giving you raw data that you can't hope to have a full grasp on in that 15-minute window of review after the game. So the bottom up decision making there will probably be based in more accurate data, more comprehensive view. So
Yeah,
if
and
done well,
knowledge too, right?
and knowledge, yeah,
Like the knowledge of the six of us is probably going to be better than the knowledge of just me.
yes, that would be the hope, right? Being it like we, and also their expertise, they've played more of that role recently than you have,
And different
presumably.
perspective and all that.
Yeah, so there's an inherent advantage there. The motivational piece, I think, is huge. Obviously, as we've touched on, feeling that you have some input, then it's respected. I think that's really, really important. Um, I do think that there are some challenges to it, which you wasn't the question, but there are some challenges which are slightly not anticipated. I don't think it fits necessarily with one personality trait. So a democratic approach could force the coach to do something that isn't actually aligned with how they are as a person,
Mm,
which can be challenging. It's
mm,
not necessarily that maybe as a result of the democratic process, you're asked to do something as a coach which doesn't fit with how you usually do things.
mm,
So I spoke in a previous episode about a team I was working with once, a basketball team, wanted me to be more louder and shout at them a little bit because they wanted to. They felt it was motivational and they felt like it was going to raise the intensity of sessions. It didn't fit with how I coached at the time, but we arrived at this through a very democratic process. So
mm,
interesting, interesting challenges that kind of rise through it.
mm.
But
Yeah. Do you?
yeah,
So this is something that I've always kind of got the sense of. Again, it's one of those things I can't remember if this is what I think because of experience or I read it or both. If you arrive at something with someone that you're working with and it comes from a more horizontal place, it tends to actually be a lot easier to sort of go in. The very colloquial way I describe it is if I'm working with someone and I can make them tell me what I was going to tell them, that's always preferable. So, I mean, I've noticed it a lot more working with other coaches than I did with players. But if I can get them to say, maybe I should quieten down and just listen to my players more, that's better than me saying, maybe you should quiet down and listen to your players more. I don't know if
yeah.
it's partly just because of the variety or because it actually does, it is better when we tell ourselves it in front of someone else. But is that something
So
that, yeah, aligns?
yeah, there's a whole field of work based on something called motivational interviewing, and a lot of it is applied to healthcare settings where it's notoriously difficult to change someone's behavior. And even just telling someone something is detrimental, everyone we all think we know what's in our best interest, and yet we act against it routinely. And telling someone something is bad for them isn't likely to have a lasting impact on their behavior. Certainly not when compared to them telling you that something is bad for them. And so there's a whole field of research around motivational interviewing and the power of letting someone come to their own conclusions and creating their own solutions and then applying them. Suppose you are guiding them in that direction when done well. But yeah,
Mm.
absolutely.
Okay. So then the last thing that I want us to go over, because last week we talked about how to get better at listening, all that kind of thing. Again, same with the conversation with Duffman. We're talking a lot about this horizontal democratic
Yeah.
style. But I do really want to be clear about the fact that I think there are problems with the vertical style of coaching, and I think there are problems with the horizontal style of coaching. And I think most coaches that do well, especially do well publicly in esports, tend to be more vertical, which is maybe why I'm more often talking about the benefits of the other way of doing things. But I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I think one is right and one is wrong. So if I was to ask you, what's the sort of steel man, the best case version of a vertical style of coaching? What are the benefits? Again, it doesn't necessarily need to be. I don't think there's also any 100% vertical situations where you're like, you will do this, you have to do this. But what is the benefit of that one coach standing at the front, maybe shouting at us if we need to be shouted at, and deciding what we do and all those kind of things? The more maybe old school approach. But
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
what's the best argument? It convinced me to do it more.
You could you could make the case in many contexts that it's it's efficient to get to the right way of behaving. So I think I'm right in thinking if you were involved in the emergency services and training to be part of the emergency services, in the training environments, you have an instructor or a trainer that will tell you what to do and when, and it's in your interest because it will keep you safe.
Mm,
And so w- there is a place for it. And I think if you're diving, for example, if you're learning to dive, it can be very dangerous, and there are things you need to do at certain times, and valves and oxygen and all this kind of stuff. Like it comes with, well, there isn't really time to hang around and consider what's the best way of moving forward here. So um, there is probably efficiency in when the information is correct and in your best interest and is keep you safe. Yes, we want
mm,
to go
mm.
vertical. Can I think of that in a sport or an esport context? I'm challenged with that.
Okay, because I would say I think the same thing, and it does apply in a sport context. So
Okay.
the things for me would always be the benefits of the vertical style of things, and again thinking about therefore when I might use it is the time efficiency, and it is the like direction if we don't have one. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's less applicable in something like esports, because when you see a clip of a coach talking to the whole squad about, clip that goes viral about how the way we're playing,
Mm.
they don't have time to talk to 20 people and get everyone's opinion. But there's 5 people on a League of Legends team. Like, there's a lot less people.
Yeah,
It takes a lot
true.
less time to get everyone's opinion before we do things. But still, it is going to be more time efficient. If we're in the middle of a best of 5, for example, and we need to fundamentally change the way we play because we're currently 0-2 down, and we've got 15 minutes in between games, and we also need to relax, and we also need to mentally reset, and we also need to plan the next draft, we might not have time to go through and say, does everyone think that potentially we shouldn't be playing around bot anymore? We should try playing around top. As a coach,
Mm.
sometimes you just need that, um, to sort of step in. I think it can be good for motivation. There was a client I worked with in the past who was a lot more on this side of things anyway. But he said, sometimes you just need someone to slam the table. And
Yeah.
from a coach's point of view, it'd be great if your player, especially your in-game leader, was the one to do that. To be like, we just need to like shake ourselves up. The classic one is like you're overthinking this best of 5. If you just played your standard game, you would win, but you've done all this like extra layer of complexity in your own head and we just need to just forget everything complicated. We play our way and we're a better team. It's great. It'd be better if that came from what your leaders within the team. But if it doesn't, sometimes it needs to come from the
Mm.
coach. There's also this thing of if there's not one voice or one idea of not literally one voice, but one sort of direction. So either there's 0 and no one knows what to do, or there's 2. Sometimes you're just going to say, right, we have to do it this way, or we're going to do it this way for this week, that way for that week, and then we're going to compare and discuss again. And
Mhm.
sometimes you just need that. Um, I also think, to be honest, a very useful thing is just trying to, at least in the moment, take responsibility away from other people if they're struggling with it, if they're struggling with the stress. Again, if we talk about the way we're playing, Let's say we're constantly playing around bot and it had been going well and now it's just going worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And if it's a player who decides, okay, now we're going to start playing around top lane and it goes badly, it's all a bit like, oh, no one wants to be the person to step in and make that decision. And sometimes, especially as a head coach, you have to just say, right, we're doing it this way. If you don't like it, tough. And if it goes wrong, it's my fault. This is what we're doing. And I think that can be a very useful thing. You have to be careful with it, of course, but I think all of those can actually be um, useful things in practice. But it's stuff like, okay, if we had enough time, I do think it probably would be always better to get everyone's opinion for those reasons that we just talked about. But again, in theory, we might always, but in practice, sometimes you'd think over a year you'd have enough time, but sometimes you just don't for whatever reason.
Yeah, I like all that. I can get on board with all that. I can see the sense in it. One thought I had was maybe vertical is isn't entirely how I'd like to phrase it. Perhaps I would rather just see it as the coach is a different role, and that role comes with the need to make decisions. And that might help in the long run because then in esports, if we can start to learn that the being a coach is a role and it has responsibilities that are different from being a player, I
Mm.
think that could be a healthy step forward for esports because
Mm.
then we might get away from this idea that the coach has to be a former high profile player.
Yeah.
And as long as if the role is introduced well to for everyone in the group to understand that if there is this impasse over how to progress, this role
Mm.
makes that decision. I think that would
Yeah.
be a healthy way of looking at it. In that respect, I think vertical doesn't work quite so well, and it is almost like it's horizontal. But one of the if you 6 dots
Mm.
horizontally, 5 blue dots, 1 red dot. The red dot makes a decision if the 5 blue dots uh,
Yeah.
can't come to
Or,
a,
or-
a make can't make a
yeah.
call.
Although again, if it, I think vertical comes from just literally when you're drawing out a organizational structure. So I guess that's still the same situation. I do think there's actually more teams who are considering that, and this is how a lot of times it works in Korea, for example. There's head coaches who are like a StarCraft pro, or there's someone who's not even
Yeah,
involved in esports,
yeah,
and I think that is actually a role that is completely missing at the moment. The idea that the head coach should be the person running every practice is a bit of a strange one, and
hmm
not something that we find in sport so much. Like it's the assistant manager who's often doing the like daily or weekly training programs in something like football, and different positions can have that more horizontal approach. And I think, to be honest, the way that I always like to conceptualize it is much more around, yes, around situations, but also around the staff team as a whole needs to be able to fulfill these certain things. They
yeah,
need to be able to have that horizontal relationship with the player so that we can make sure we get all the information, all the data, all the best ideas. But they also do need to have that ability to make the decision if a decision needs to be made. And that's where having multiple people, I think, makes sense and I think is the future, but it's always risky. There's organizations who've been thinking about it for a long time, but you never want to be the first person to say, right, we're doing this. We're going to have a head coach who's much more like a line manager, and we're going to have assistant coaches who are all former players who are basically like extra players. And maybe you've got 5 of them and a head coach or whatever it might
yeah.
be. Yeah,
The
like I
tricky
say.
thing, of course, is if you. I think you and me have probably can both think of situations where the tricky thing is this is sort of what might be known to the whole group, whether it's horizontal or vertical. The tricky thing is when it's portrayed as maybe more horizontal and more democratic, and yet maybe, for example, a coach might use an ally in the team to push a certain way of thinking and doing.
Mm, yeah.
That's great micro political skill, but it's also a manipulation of the
Machiavellian skill,
context.
yeah.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
the tricky thing is it's like these are nice ideals, but
Mm,
there will
mm.
be
I think,
dynamics.
yeah, and I think that's a really big one for me as well. If you're thinking about the dangers of this more, again, I'm going to keep using vertical, but maybe I should come up with something different. This more like vertical style is the reverse of what you mentioned for the horizontal. You have this danger of sort of trampling
Yeah,
people, and I think the biggest thing, although it's important for both, but the biggest thing for any kind of verticality is clarity.
Yeah.
We need to know exactly why this decision is being made and why not. Even if we just take, okay, there's two different ways that people want to play the game. It's not going to be productive to go to find a compromise. So I'm going to decide that we're doing this way. And I've made this, if you want, I've made this decision because X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's actually probably better to not even say that. And definitely don't say I've made this decision because the player who suggested it is my mate
Yeah.
or anything like that. But it's like, look, we need a way to play the game. So we have to do this and you have to suck it up. Like I saw a bit of only the very beginning actually of Whippo coaching or giving some advice to this one of these streamer teams in the NLC, the casual scene. And he was saying the really important thing is that when you're doing lane swaps, someone is going to lose and you need to decide who's going to lose. You will lose gold on the map. And so someone just needs to decide who that is. And if no one is deciding and you're a coach, it's much better to just say, look, okay, someone needs to lose and no one's volunteered. So like, this is what we're going to do. And hopefully you also have the time to say, we're going to do it this way for this time, this way for this time. We're going to see how both work. But if not, sometimes you just have to say, look, sometimes the best leaders and the people who follow them don't necessarily like them all the time. And I think that's something you have to accept as a coach. And if you want to be that more vertical, horizontal style, and you want to be friends with the players, and that's something that you get a lot from, then maybe a head coach shouldn't really be the role for you. And I think it's maybe difficult to find both. I don't know if that's too extreme, but that's my current thoughts on it.
No, great example. Yeah, wonderful example of that. I don't want to lose gold. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think lots of good thoughts there. The art of selling and rhetoric and using power of persuasion. That's all part of the coach's remit for sure. Yeah, maybe just one thing that I came across here was that apparently in the sort of Dutch governmental system, they have a word for this idea that leaders need to alternate between different leadership styles, and it's called schakelen.
Shackling.
Schakelen. So if we've got any Dutch listeners, I'd love to know if that's come across your radar, because I've also heard it called it's called kaleidoscopic leadership and things like this, where things
Okay.
alternative forms are used at different times. And I thought it was
Okay.
really interesting. So I did a deep dive into political science. It was great.
Mm.
Lots of interesting stuff there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think
Yeah.
it all comes down to your judgment, right? Your judgment at what times to use what, and then, as you said, clarity. Do
Mm.
people anticipate? Do they understand why?
Mm.
All hugely important.
Yeah. And tying it back into Duffman again at the end,
Yeah.
knowing what you are as a person and knowing what suits you. And I would say that you should probably learn about the other side of things no matter which side you are, even if you rarely use it, just for, well, at the very least, the appreciation of other coaches that you might work with. Because
Yeah.
you obviously have a tendency, if you're very horizontal, to see a vertical coach and be like, "Oh, I noticed that this player didn't like that, and he didn't notice, and he should have got this, or she, or whoever, you know." Um,
Yeah.
so I think, yeah, learning about the other side, pulling us back towards the middle. And to be
Yeah.
honest, I mean, this is maybe opening another topic, and I was kind of trying to wrap up. But if we talk the Tenenbaum Schmidt thing that we used before, where we have like very horizontal on one side and very vertical on the other side, the thing that I would always say, and a mistake that I've made in the past, is coming into teams and starting too far on the democratic side of things. But the thing that I would always say is I'm always going that way. I never want to be going the other way. The idea is we come in and we say, okay, right, here's the clarity, here's the space, here's the things that you get to control, and I want to gradually give you more and more control. Next week we might touch on, or after Christmas, I should say, we might touch on how to work with other coaches. And again, that's the same thing for me. It's like, okay, if you're the draft coach, at the beginning, I want you to prepare draft in this certain way, so you can present it in this way, so that I can check over it and so that we can kind of poke holes in it. But as it goes on more and more, you can do it in whatever way you want. And I'll probably check it less and less, because you'll gradually be getting more control and more freedom, because I'll know that it's going to be to that level that we need, so you're always going towards the more horizontal way, I think, is a good way to think about it. But I definitely have skipped the framing before, which I think can often be too far. Um,
Yeah.
as a very short practical example, it's like coming into a team and saying, right, what are our values as a team? And then doing that democratically, I think is very challenging and often ends up in not good situations. And so nowadays, I've got a load of exercises that I do first before we get to the stage where we say, okay, now what are your values? And I leave the room. And I love that. But we do the other things first so that they can then come up with rules together, but with that framing kind of in mind.
Yeah. Adding some structure, I think, is always welcome, even if it's autocratically adding structure to begin with. Cool.
Great. Well, I did mention it just then, but we won't be back for the next maybe couple of weeks over Christmas, and then we'll keep everyone updated about what's going on in the new year. But thanks very much for watching again, and again, Watson, thanks for the conversation. Really good. I think we
Thank you, John.
we
It's
can
been a
keep
pleasure.
going on all this stuff forever.
Yeah. And hopefully we can keep going strong, pick up in 2025 and keep it rolling. This has been great. So,
Awesome. All right. See you
yeah.
guys.
Bye.